I'm Laurie Ford, and currently I'm the director of the Early Childhood Education program at UBC. But my actual home faculty appointment is in the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology, where I work um, in addition to early childhood education with the human development, learning and culture, and the school psychology programs. Currently, I would say kind of some of the main areas that I've worked in pretty much throughout my career has been looking at not only young children, but young children and how their families and educators are engaged in their learning. So it's taken a lot of different focuses over the years. More recently, it's tended to look more at the engagement of families, particularly families from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds, immigrant families, and those areas, and how they're involved with their kids, early learning. I also do some work with school-age kids as well, but that's been a big focus. I hope that the advancing knowledge is being able to support my graduate students in their work. I mean, I really had this wonderful lab of students from a variety of different areas, including early childhood education. And they put really their own kind of twist on my area. And I think working with them, that's sort of generating knowledge translation in a kind of a different way. I joke with my students that I'm old and I've been doing this a long time. And I thought it was an interesting question because it really made me reflect on my choice of research methodologies. Ultimately, the thing I tell my graduate students, and I still believe this, is that the methodology should not guide your question. Your purpose and your question should guide the methodology that you use. However, with that in mind, I've been doing this a long time. Early in my career, my background is both in psychology and education. And so my early career, as a school psychologist, I did a lot of real traditional quantitative structural equation modeling, factor analysis work, looking at measures in early childhood. So the focus was less on the kids, but more on the tools we use. But when about midway through my career, I really got connected. And I'd always had a little bit of interest in qualitative because I just like to sit and talk with people about stuff. And I'd gotten exposed, and there'd often been a bit of a, for lack of a better term, qualitative interviewing component. But then I sat down and I started really studying, and I had the privilege of taking some courses as a faculty member. I went and sat in some lectures and a number of different qualitative approaches. So, I guess the questions that I'm interested in now lend themselves a bit more to qualitative methodologies. And I realize that it's not just a dichotomy, but I think I probably tend to use phenomenology, grounded theory. We're doing a number of studies that we're looking at theory development around family engagement and how you work with families. And what I like about moving towards these type of approaches, and qualitative, again, not just interviewing, but observing and looking at interactions and environments. I think that the questions I'm interested in now are sort of guiding the type of research I'm doing. But maybe more than anything, more recently, I think I'm starting to utilize both, maybe more survey, probably nothing too fancy qualitative, but maybe some single subject design work paired with some narrative or IPA or grounded theories type of studies. Again, that was probably, of the questions you gave me, the hardest one to think about. I wish I had one of those crazy pivotal moments. It just feels like it's really been an evolution to me. If you look throughout the research that I've done, there's lots of different things, but I think a constant has always been conversations with families and children. And I think maybe a few pivotal moments were maybe early in my career, doing work as a psychologist and talking with families of young children about trying to learn about where their kids are with their development, maybe having to share diagnoses with them where they're having some challenges. And I always think that as psychologists, we think everything we have to say is so important. And then what would happen is, after we'd leave the meeting a day or two later, the parents couldn't even remember, what we talked about. So I started thinking around that time, this was probably about, I'd always done a bit of this kind of work, but probably about 10 or 12 years ago, I really started thinking, I really want to do research that is on how do we communicate from their perspective. So we've been trying to do a series of studies. A number of my students' thesis and dissertations have been around how do you communicate with families and professionals and even children sometimes, because it's important for children to know where they're at and where they are with their learning. So we've been trying to use approaches that engage them, not just passively in paper pencil, but that we have conversations with them, and to really try to make sure that, again, that the work we're doing isn't necessarily something that just, not that showing up in a journal isn't a bad thing, but that's really practical. So that starts to become a real important piece of it to me. My goodness. Well, I've been doing this a long time. So to think about the future is like, gosh, to think about where I started and where I am now is a big, big change. I think some of the things that I'm excited about and I'm curious about, and again, it's so much driven by the amazing graduate students that I get to work with and their interests. And so, to move from just looking at, again, a survey or questions or just simple interviews, but to look at approaches and methodologies that are creative in the ways that they explore children and families in natural, I think people talk about place-based or natural environments. So I've been again, I have no expertise in this. I mean, I've done a few studies where my students have done drawings with kids. We've done, art with kids. And so I've spent a lot of time over the last few months reading about arts-based inquiry. And for sure, I'm not going to be an arts-based inquiry person. I'm not a good enough artist. I don't know about art, but I like materials as ways to engage participants in our research. So I like toys, or I'm like, I like to use toys when I'm doing assessment, trying to understand developmental levels. So I think, what's exciting for me, I think that's one, is that we're getting more creative in the ways that we reach out and engage participants, families, kids, educators in our research. I think a second one is that we're much more mindful of their environments. I'm very much, Yuri Bronfenbrenner has driven the way I look at the world since I was an undergrad, and that we're not just looking at classrooms, that we're realizing that young children exist in multiple environments, and some of that is playgrounds, and some of that's, cafeterias and all kinds of different places, and that we're looking at those environments and how they interact in those environments. So I think those are kind of the two big trends. And then I just also really appreciate, although I think it can be challenging, is that we're conducting and doing research in a really different time in our world with our focus on equity and diversity and inclusiveness. I think I've always kind of been interested in inclusive education, and I've always been interested in work with families from diverse backgrounds. But I think understanding and making sure that we empower those voices in the work that we do is probably, those would kind of be my three big, I don't know if they're trends, but things that I see that seem to be evolving and changing and that are interesting to me, and things that I see playing out in the great research that my graduate students are doing.